Thank you. I am project manager for the Kentucky SOS program with the Kentucky Hospital Association. We are delighted that you have joined us this morning for our monthly webinar. In addition, from KHA, we have Claire Arendt, Melanie Mock with us that are on the Kentucky SOS team, and then other members from our quality team. So thank you so much for joining this morning. We have a wonderful presentation today from one of our the Kentucky SOS program's advisory committee members, Dr. Alex Ellswick. So just a few housekeeping things. Make sure you are muted so that we don't have any background distractions this morning. And Dr. Ellswick will do his presentation, and feel free to put any questions in the chat box. And then at the end of his presentation, we will unmute the lines, or you can unmute yourself and then you can ask directly over the phone. Otherwise, please utilize the chat box for any questions you may have today during this presentation. Like all past Kentucky SOS webinars, this recording and presentation slides will be posted on the Kentucky SOS website, and we will put the address in there. Definitely check it out, or if you want to share it with a colleague, by all means, that's a great resource. And then I will also send it out to all the project leads. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Alex Ellswick this morning. He is a tireless advocate for people with substance use disorders. He earned a BA from Center College and MS from University of Kentucky, and has finished his PhD at UK also. Alex's knowledge and experience with addiction is multifaceted. His professional experience, nonprofit work, and research agenda all focus on long-term recovery. But most importantly, Alex is himself a person in long-term recovery from the chronic disease of addiction. And like I've mentioned before, Alex is a vital member on the Kentucky SOS Advisory Committee, and Kentucky SOS welcomes Dr. Alex Ellswick. Alex?
Thank you and good morning. I'm Dr. Alex Ellswick. Everybody see my screen there? Okay. I'm Dr. Alex Ellswick. I'm really excited to be here with you all this morning, and grateful you all are on. Kind of as a platitude, when you speak publicly, a lot of times people will say, hey, it's good to see you here. Thanks for being here. But more and more, I've been realizing that, especially for a webinar like this, you all are choosing to opt in to be here. And you could be doing something else with your time. And that's meaningful to me. And I appreciate that. It shows an open-mindedness and a willingness and a desire to be a part of the solution. And that's what we all want. So genuinely, thank you for that. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, focusing on substance use prevention and recovery, and also co-founder of a nonprofit recovery community organization in Lexington called Voices of Hope. And we fancy ourselves sort of a one-stop shop for all things recovery. So we help folks with everything from housing to physical and mental health service referrals, to education and scholarships, to removing barriers like expunging records, on and on. And the reason that I do that work is because, as you heard, I'm a person in long-term recovery from an addiction to Oxycontin and subsequently to heroin. And so what I've been asked to do today is to share a little bit about my experience, my lived experience of living in recovery during the holidays. And it's a great topic. I'm really glad that I was prompted to think about this a little bit, because there really is something unique about the holidays. This is a picture of me with my mom probably 3 or 4 years ago. So probably about 4 or 5 years into recovery. And that was a really good Christmas. And that's why I started with that picture. It was a great holiday. During my addiction, I experienced a lot of different kinds of holidays inside institutions, holidays in halfway houses, holidays in jail, a lot of holidays where you didn't really have the opportunity to experience the joy and the depth of the holiday. So I thought I would start by laying a little bit of groundwork in saying that even if we're not talking about recovery, the holidays can be a really challenging time. There's something about all of the expectation and all of the obligation and all of the stress that's levied on this period of time that can kind of set us up for failure in some respects. And if you don't believe me, then at your next family holiday gathering, I would encourage you to start by bringing up masks and then bring up the COVID-19 vaccine and see if you get a good fight going among your family members. And if that doesn't quite push them to the edge, just mention one of our current or former president and see if that alone, you just have to say their names and see if that doesn't set everybody off. So I say that somewhat jokingly, but then I found this cartoon and I think it's terrific. You have one final test on your path to spiritual enlightenment. And what is it? Surviving the holidays with your family. And as you can see, this poor fella is not taking it so well. And so I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but it's also important to recognize that there's some truth to this. There's a reason that there are so many cultural references to family stress during the holidays. There was a rerun of a Everybody Loves Raymond episode on a couple of weeks ago that was sort of pointing out the stress that families experience during the holidays. And that can be true for a variety of reasons, whether it's because you're fortunate enough to be with family who stress you out, or if it's because you don't have the benefit of family support. There can be a variety of reasons. But we know that when you add on top of the holiday season, the difficulties and the vulnerabilities of being a person in recovery, and particularly if you're a person early in recovery, we know that that's an incredible challenge. And so what I want to do today is start by sharing just a little bit of my personal experience. I won't get too carried away. We'll keep it at about 10 minutes or less, but I just want to share a little bit so that you know kind of what my experience has been. It'll also allow me to illustrate a couple points I want to make. And then we'll get into talking about kind of tips from my holiday survival guide, if you like. So I am born and bred in Lexington, Kentucky, and born in really fortunate circumstances. My dad's a doctor, my mom's an accountant. I had everything that I needed. I grew up in the suburbs and went to private school. Really ideal childhood. But there are two risk factors that I frequently point out that I really couldn't change as a child. And the first is that I inherited a robust genetic predisposition for addiction. There's extensive addiction in my extended family that research tells me put me at increased risk. But secondly, and I think just as importantly, from the time that I was about 12, I've struggled with anxiety. And I've been diagnosed with a host of different anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, which is sort of garden variety anxiety, social anxiety disorder, which really complicates the way I build relationships with other people. And then trichotillomania, which maybe a clinician on the call today is familiar with. It's a hair pulling disorder. It's kind of in the DSM. It was grouped with anxiety disorders, and it's sort of been regrouped with obsessive compulsive disorders. But what's most important for you to understand about that is that I spent probably 10 years struggling to understand what I was dealing with. Those anxiety disorders didn't get diagnosed until I was 21 years old. And so that meant I spent really the most significant decade of my own life in terms of my own human development, struggling against these veritable mental disorders that I didn't even know I had. I knew that my experience was different from other people around me, but mostly I just had a lot of internalized shame about it. I just thought I didn't handle stress well. And I thought I was kind of weak in that sense. And it took me a while to come to learn that I was bearing a burden that most other people aren't. And that explains pretty well why at 14 or 15, I really started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And so here's a picture of me, I think probably at about 17 years old. And there's so much we could say about this picture. I went through a 5-year period of my life where I wore nothing but a white tee. And I'm not going to tell you that that's a gang sign because I am not a member of a gang. I'm not really sure what that is. I think that's just my attempt to be cool. That's just an insecure 17-year-old, anxious 17-year-old there. But, you know, I experimented like a lot of kids do. I don't think it sent up any red flags. I played golf and basketball and baseball at Henry Clay High School in Lexington. And then I got the chance to go to Center College to play baseball. And I think moving to a new academic environment, a new social environment, particularly as a person with social anxiety. It was a challenge for me. And so as my anxiety sort of ramped up and up and up, so too did my use of cannabis as a way of sort of trying to self-medicate the anxiety that I was feeling. And it got to a point where I found it necessary to start selling drugs in order to support my use of drugs. And I ended up getting prescribed opioids. I had oral surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed, and I was prescribed oxycodone by the oral surgeon. And I took it exactly the way that it was prescribed by my doctor. I didn't abuse it. I ended up getting a second script when I had dry sockets in the 4 wounds in my mouth. So they gave me basically like a 30-day supply of opioids for what is a relatively minor outpatient procedure. And thanks to organizations like the Opioid Stewardship Committee, that's not something we would probably have done today. I think today we would say, my goodness, here's a person with genetic risk. Here's a person with co-occurring mental disorders. Here's a person with a long past history of substance use. Probably not the kind of guy we want to put opioids into his system. But in any event, I got addicted. And for the sake of time, I've got to kind of just fast forward through all this and tell you that addiction took me all the bad places that a person can go. I went to jail on drug trafficking charges when I was 18 years old. And that was a really bad experience for me. I ended up going in and out of treatment centers and sort of being kicked out by my family, kicked out by my girlfriend. And eventually I ended up homeless in 4 different cities, in Nashville, Tennessee, Lexington, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio. And I spent the very end of my addiction sleeping under this bridge. This is the Highway 35 overpass that runs through downtown Dayton, Ohio. And I ended up homeless in Dayton, sleeping under this bridge and holding a cardboard sign by the side of the road that said homeless and hungry, and shooting heroin. And, you know, when you look at the graphs of the 3 trajectories of the opioid epidemic, from prescription pain pills to heroin to fentanyl, and you see with the introduction of fentanyl, that inflection point where there's a sharp increase in overdoses. The last day that I found it necessary to use heroin was September 13th of 2013, which is maybe months before the huge spike in overdoses due to fentanyl. So I consider myself very lucky in that respect. I also shared needles at various times, including when I was homeless, with some folks who I have to think had Hep C or HIV, and I was really fortunate not to contract either. So I just consider that the grace of God, or some particular stroke of luck, or however you choose to see that. But this is a picture of the last day that I was dropped off at the Salvation Army, or that I walked into the Salvation Army. And there's so much in this picture that you can't appreciate. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And my clothes are baggy, so you can't tell how underweight I was. I probably weighed 40 pounds less than I do now. And there's something about my body language, the arms stuck out, that just kind of says, well, here I am again, you know, back at another treatment center, and not real hopeful at my prospects. But I was fortunate that I had a place to go. And I spent 6 of the most difficult months of my life at this homeless shelter in Dayton, just learning how to live again, truly rehabilitating in every sense of the word. And I had a tremendous amount of support in every conceivable way when it came time to get out and reintegrate. People helped me to find housing, even though I was on food stamps and disqualified from Section 8 because of my drug trafficking charge. People helped me get a job, even though I had no college degree and no marketable skills and huge gaps in my resume. People helped me get transportation. I mean, I had help to get the resources that I needed so that I could recover meaningfully and fully and really have full life again. And what that looked like for me is I had the opportunity to go back and finish my bachelor's degree, which I didn't know if I would ever do, to be honest with you. And then I got the chance to finish a master's degree and a doctorate. So this is a picture of my graduate school cohort in 2015, and got the chance to co-found Voices of Hope. This is a picture that was taken at one of our International Overdose Awareness Day observations. Love these people. And I get to be with my family. I get to be a son, and I get to be a partner, and I get to be a brother. This is a picture during graduate school. I actually would go to breakfast with my parents every Wednesday. We would go to the Waffle House, because of course you do. And my mom's wearing a shirt that says "Resting Brunch Face" because she's just a cool mom like that. And then finally, during the COVID-19 pandemic, my mental health went kind of south for a little while, and someone suggested that I get a dog. And so the little head you see sticking out of the top is my puppy, my Cavapoo buddy. And I really had just built these pictures in as a way to help me tell this story, and I was prepared to move on. But as I was just reflecting on the slide deck the other day, I noticed something about this slide right here. And I think it tells such an important story and probably makes the most significant point that I want to make today. And that is, there's a pattern. There's a pattern that in all of the pictures on the top row of me and addiction, I'm completely alone. In every sense of the word, completely alone. And when you look at the pictures of me in recovery, I'm surrounded by people. I'm surrounded by connection. And I joke sometimes and tell people that I don't have time to relapse, which really is a joke, because I know full well that relapse is a reality, a real possibility for all of us in recovery. But what I mean to say when I say that, what I'm really trying to communicate is, one of the great benefits I have today is I have so many reciprocal obligations. Most of them are things that I want to do. Some of them are things that I don't want to do. But I have so many reciprocal obligations that people are expecting me to show up. And I expect people to show up for me. And that kind of connection, in recovery, we say it puts you in the middle of the boat, or it puts you in the middle of the pack. You know, if you're running with your pack of gazelles or whatever it is, the lion's going to attack the weak one on the outside. So you want to get right in the middle. And to me, that's what connection and belongingness does for people in recovery. It's the most important thing, and it's the thing that we probably as a society do the very worst. And so before I jump into my kind of holiday survival guide, I just want to lay a little bit of a scientific groundwork for that. So the first comes from some really cool research. So in the 1950s, researchers put rats in a cage, and they gave them two sources of water. One was plain water, and the other was water laced with morphine. And the research team observed the rats continuously return to use the water laced with morphine, and they would use it to the utter neglect of their basic needs. So they stopped eating, they stopped bonding, they stopped mating. All that they cared about was this very singular obsession with morphine. And so the researchers concluded, hey, there's our model of addiction right there. You get exposed to an addictive substance and you get addicted to it and use it till you die. And that's fine. But about 20 years later, some other researchers came along and said, you know, that's not really an accurate reflection of the way that people use drugs in the real world, because people don't live by themselves in cages, right? And I submit to you that if you kidnapped me today and put me in a cage for an indefinite period of time, morphine water might be a little more alluring all of a sudden, right? So what they did was they created what's called Rat Park, which you see on the left side of your screen. It's basically heaven for rats. Like if you and I are rats, this is prime rat real estate, because you've got all the toilet paper rolls to crawl through and all the hamster wheels to exercise on, and you're in this thriving community with all your rat buddies. And then the researchers replicated the study. They introduced the same two sources of water. But in Rat Park, the results were completely different. The vast majority of the rats didn't like the water laced with morphine, and those who did used it in moderation. None of the rats in Rat Parks died, despite exposure to the very same substance that was killing all the rats in the cage. And there are lots of different conclusions that you can draw from this study that are pretty interesting. But I think what's most significant for our purposes is two things. One, the importance of connection, the importance of community, of being with people, and how that changes substance use outcomes. And I also think Rat Park tells you a story about attractive alternatives, which is to say, in isolation, and when you don't have anything else to bring about pleasure or joy or connection, you're probably going to be tempted to use drugs. But when you have attractive alternatives, when you have something better to do, in layman's terms, you might do that instead. And this is also reflected in prevention research in a really cool way that I think bears importantly for people in recovery, and particularly during the holidays. And that's the case of Iceland. So in 1998, Iceland surveyed 15 and 16-year-olds, and they found that 25% of them had been drunk in the past 30 days. Not just had had a drink, but had actually drank to the point of intoxication. And that's a lot. To put that in perspective for you, that figure in the United States is almost always somewhere between 5 and 10%. So Iceland knew they had a problem, and they convened a panel of experts, and they sort of had a defenestration of the old way. So they said, we're not going to do just say no, and we're not just going to repeat the refrain, drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. Instead, we're going to focus on protective factors, and we're going to focus on providing youth with attractive alternatives to drugs. So instead of trying to scare them away from drugs, what if we try to encourage them towards something else? And so what they did was this massive investment in infrastructure in things like soccer fields and gymnastics arenas and hockey rinks. And every kid under the age of 18 was given a leisure card, which you can think of like a Dave & Buster's card that's preloaded with $250 a year so that you can go to arcades and go to movie theaters. And ultimately what it did is it had the effect of getting kids off of street corners and onto a field where they can generate dopamine and they can generate positive feelings, and they're doing it together. It's pro-social, which by itself is actually benefiting their brain chemistry. And then they surveyed another cohort of 15 and 16-year-olds 18 years later in 2016, and they found that the percentage who had been drunk in the past 30 days had been reduced from 25% to 5%, a 5-fold decrease in youth who'd been drunk in the past 30 days, almost entirely with carrots and not sticks, almost entirely by saying, let's give kids opportunities to be kids in a safe and healthy way. And so The Atlantic ran a great article on this a couple of years ago. And I loved the article, but I bring it up because I want to suggest to the author just one minor change, which is the title of the article is a little bit misleading, because it's really not about how Iceland got teens to say no to drugs. It's really about how Iceland got teens to say yes to something else. And so one more just little scientific tidbit to lay some groundwork. None of this is surprising if you recognize that this is how the brain works. So this is an article published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience called The Rewarding Nature of Social Interactions. And I think the title tells it all. The reward that is derived from social interactions is actually a neurochemical reward. So what this article discusses is how social interactions actually upregulate dopamine activity. And without getting lost in neuroscience, which certainly isn't my expertise, what we know is that fundamentally what's happening in the addicted brain is dopamine downregulation, like a dopamine deficit. So quite literally, social interactions are organic medicine for the addicted brain. One-to-one, they heal the very part of your brain that's addicted. And that's why it is so incredibly critical that people who use drugs have the opportunity to connect with other people, that they have as many contact points with society as possible, as many reciprocal obligations as possible. And unfortunately, as a society, too often we do exactly the opposite. We design structures that ostracize people, that push them away. If you're a person who gets a felony because you have a drug possession charge, you probably can't get FAFSA or WIC or TANF or any of the things that you might need to actually have a meaningful recovery. So this leads me to my first tip for the holiday survival guide, which is quite simply connect. You have to connect with people. And one of the things I've learned as a person, not only in recovery from addiction, but also from my social anxiety disorder, is that I often have to be really intentional about connecting with people. I don't always do it naturally. I often rely on the work that I do to keep me connected to people. So the work at UK, the work at Voices, every day that sort of forces me into interactions with people. And by the end of the day, I'm glad I did it. But there's something different about the holidays, right? So all of a sudden, if maybe you're not going to work or your schedule just looks different. And so you, as a person in recovery, you may have to sort of take it upon yourself to reach out to people and to create opportunities to connect. Because every time you connect with another human being and you experience that bonding and that dopamine flow, you're literally healing your addicted brain. Excuse me. So holiday tip number 2, Structure your days. This picture is a picture of what I'm generally hoping for out of my holidays. So inevitably this happens for me. In the weeks leading up to the holidays, they're particularly stressful, especially on a college campus where I'm trying to get grades in and wrap up the end of the semester. So it's an anxious time. And, you know, I'm waking up and dreading these long days and looking ahead to the holidays. And I build it up in my mind. Oh my goodness, I can't wait until I have all this time off. All I want to do is put on a real loose pair of sweatpants and lay on my couch and binge watch a Netflix show, right? But inevitably, this is what happens. The holidays arrive, great relief. I get that first day on the couch and I enjoy the first episode. I enjoy the second episode a little less and the third episode even less. And what I find is for myself, I don't handle big, empty, open, unstructured days very well. They sound really nice in my mind until I'm there and I have nothing to do. And one of the things I've learned as a person in recovery is idle time is not good for me. It's really not. That doesn't mean that I can't relax, but it does mean that I have to be intentional about the way that I spend my time. And I think that's part of what makes the holidays really right for relapse, for a return to use, because you have so much unstructured time and your mind can really run all over the place. And so what I like to do during the holidays is to continue to structure my day much in the same way that I do while I'm working. So I continue to wake up at the same time. I go to the gym at the same time. I eat breakfast at the same time. My friends joke and say that I'd be the easiest person in America to assassinate because you know where I'm going to be at every minute of the day. But I found that just really works for me. It helps to take some anxiety out of my day, takes some unpredictability out of my day, and also has the added benefit of keeping me a little more productive. Holiday tip number 3. Nosce te ipsum. This is Latin for know thyself. I have this tattoo on my left rib cage. It's actually the first admonition of the mythological Oracle of Delphi. And although the Oracle might be mythological, I think the advice is no less wise. And really what I mean in this context by know yourself and know your family is all things being equal, the research on families and recovery seems to suggest that family support improves recovery outcomes. The problem with that is I know from my experience as a family therapist that no two families are alike. And there are often family situations where there are family members who desire to be supportive, but the real world impact of that attempt to be supportive is actually harmful. And so you have to know for yourself, is my family a source of support for me, or could they be maybe not a source of support for me at this time? You have to ask yourself questions about what is drug use and alcohol use like within your family of origin. You know, one of the things I found is, you know, if I'm going to be in an environment where there's alcohol, it might increase my anxiety just a little bit. So that might be something you want to think about. Not just does your family drink, but how does your family drink? Do they drink a little bit or do they drink hard? You know, and is that going to be something that bothers you? And also have some introspection. I've learned that before I walk into any social situation, I have to kind of take a temperature on how I'm feeling on the inside, where I'm standing, because if I'm in the wrong state of mind, it sets me up for bad social interactions. So I'm a fortunate person in so many ways. I'm fortunate to have family who are living and who are in my life and who I find generally very supportive. But still, even having said that, that brings me to my holiday tip number 4, which is always have a contingency plan. And this might derive more from my social anxiety and my addiction recovery. But one of my biggest fears is being stuck in an uncomfortable social situation, kind of like a social claustrophobia. So I can imagine in my head a scenario where I drive to a holiday party, there's lots of alcohol being consumed, it makes me a little uncomfortable, I decide to leave, but I go outside to find that my car is blocked in. That's a nightmare situation for me. And so I take really pragmatic precautions around that very thing. I make sure to park at the back of a line or out of the way, and I make sure to drive myself so that I can make an escape if I need to. And to be honest with you all, I used to have a lot of shame about my desire to leave social situations. And so a lot of times I would just force myself to stay and be uncomfortable and be unhappy, which wasn't good for me and it wasn't good for people around me. And so I've just learned to give myself permission. When it's time to go, it's time to go. And something that can help with that a whole heck of a lot is to recruit the help of your family members. Sometimes I would tell my mom beforehand, I would kind of check what's going on inside me, how I'm feeling before I go to spend the holidays with my family. And there was at least one occasion early in recovery where I told my mom, I'm probably going to stay for dinner and then turn around and leave. And I'm really grateful that she's supportive to the extent that she understands. She understands that's the nature of my anxiety and she doesn't want me to be uncomfortable. And she's not going to take it personally that I leave the holiday early. But it still allows me to spend some time with my family, which I think is just so critical, just to connect with other people. Holiday tip number 5 is practice gratitude. And I'm going to tell you that I had lots of therapists talk to me about practicing gratitude early in my process of attempting recovery. And I rolled my eyes quite a bit, if we can be honest. I've just always thought that was such a insignificant thing. It felt like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, you know? And what I've learned over time, in part from reading some of the research on gratitude, is that it's actually really effective. It's actually incredibly effective. And there's plenty of scientific evidence to back it. So one of the things I think is dangerous about the holidays is the obligation and the expectation. So number one, there's sort of this pervasive sense of obligation, all these things we feel like we have to do during the holidays, which in some respects is kind of a bummer, right? Because this is supposed to be our time to relax and enjoy. And instead, it's sort of still work when you're doing things you don't want to be doing, that obligation. Also, I think there's a tremendous expectation. It's the season of giving. It's the season of joy. It's all this kind of stuff. That's some lofty expectations, you know? And I think it sort of sets us up for failure in the sense that we're all expecting to have this great, easy, fun time, and it just doesn't always go that way. And the most effective way to prevent a letdown is practicing gratitude. And what I like to do, my favorite gratitude practice, because it's one that I'll actually engage in, is to write down 3 things I'm grateful for and then meditate on them a little bit. So as I was building this presentation, I just thought in this moment, what am I grateful for right now? And the first thing that came to mind was my job at the University of Kentucky. There was a time when I thought I would never be able to get a job beyond flipping burgers, you know, or working in landscaping. I always wanted to do more, but I really thought that my past would be a hindrance in so many ways. And I am so grateful for all of the people who gave me chances, for all of the people who saw the humanity behind my drug use. And the fact that I get to have a career today is a beautiful thing. And anytime that I'm feeling bad about my day, I can remind myself about how lucky I am to have this job, and it helps. It makes a difference. Then my puppy dog was banging up against my leg as I was putting this together, and I thought, man, I'm grateful for this guy. His name's Buddy. And there's something that I genuinely, I'm almost embarrassed how good it feels to me to have that dog greet me at the door every time I get home from work. My girlfriend sure doesn't run to the door like the way he runs to the door. You know what I mean? There's just something pure and beautiful about that. And I'm grateful for that. And lastly, as I was putting this together, I was just thinking, I'm grateful for the Kentucky statewide opioid stewardship committee. I'm grateful for the time, the investment that so many people make, and for the intentionality, what we're trying to accomplish, which is preventing another person's child from having to experience the kind of suffering that I had to experience. And that's an amazing thing. And I'm grateful that I get to be a part of that. As a quick reminder, this is SAMHSA's definition of recovery. It's a process of change through which individuals do 3 things and 3 things only. They improve their health, they live an autonomous life, and they strive to reach their full potential. What you notice is there's no reference to drugs or alcohol, and there's no reference to abstinence whatsoever. And too many of us have been kind of led to believe that abstinence equals recovery and recovery equals abstinence. And that's just not the reality, y'all. I wanted to make sure I made that point so that we all recognize people who are early in this process of change, maybe they're continuing to use drugs, but they desire to use in a safer way. They're in recovery. They're in the process. Just think about your trans-theoretical model. They're just very early on in the process, right? So I think it's important that we acknowledge when we're recovering during the holidays, for some people, that looks like continuing to use. And for others, it may be the case that they experience a relapse or return to use during the holidays. And if that's the case, the most important thing that you can do is to be together. We return to that same tip. I think a lot of people, most people probably, I don't have literature to support this off the top of my head, but my guess would be most people relapse alone. And the reason for that would be there's so much shame. After you've built up a period of sobriety, there's so much shame behind a relapse. There doesn't need to be, but there often is. And so people end up using alone, and using alone is a huge, huge risk factor for a fatal overdose. So never use alone. Just don't do it. If you're not with anybody and you're using, call somebody, FaceTime somebody, let them in a little bit so they can keep you safer. If you or someone you love is using opioids, really, if they're using any kind of illicit substance, you need to have Narcan available. We're seeing increasing fentanyl in the supply of meth and coke and crack. And part of the reason that's so concerning is a lot of those folks who are primarily stimulant users are opioid naive, which is going to put them at greatly increased risk of experiencing an opioid overdose when their dope is contaminated. And finally, the advice I think that we give in prescribing opioids, very similar to the advice we give to people who use drugs, which is start low and go slow. We tell our folks at the center to consider doing a tester before they do the rest of their dope, because you don't know what's in it today. You really just don't know what you're taking. And it is the contaminants and the mixing of drugs that are leading to the preponderance of overdoses. I think in our state, in Kentucky, 71% of fatal overdoses in 2020 had fentanyl. Second bonus holiday tip is to prepare your elevator speech. And so I'll tell you a story about this. The truth is, I've never been that bothered by people drinking alcohol in general. Alcohol was never really something that I liked a whole lot. So it just hasn't been something that bothers me. But what does bother me is when people get drunk. And that's a weird thing, and I don't know how to explain it, but it doesn't bother me to see people drink responsibly. But when people are really getting rip-roaring drunk, I feel a tinge of jealousy. And I have a memory of being pretty early in recovery, just a little over a year in recovery, and sitting at a sports bar in Lexington watching a Kentucky basketball game. And I remember feeling the atmosphere in the room swell. So, when the whole group, room full of people are drinking alcohol and the energy just grows and grows and grows. And there was just a part of me that felt really left out. Like, they're really all having a lot more fun than I am. They're really all connected in some way that I feel disconnected. And that's a problem. And that's a situation that can make me very uncomfortable. And so one of the things you might want to consider before going out during the holidays is, how am I going to respond if alcohol is present and I'm a person who doesn't drink alcohol? If you're a person who is trying to abstain from alcohol, prepare an elevator speech, prepare some type of a rote scripted statement, whatever you're going to say. And it doesn't have to be anything in particular. No, thank you is a perfectly acceptable thing to say. You can tell people, hey, I'm driving home. I'm not drinking tonight. Usually what I tell people is I don't drink very well. And often they give me a confused look and we just leave it at that. The final tip that I want to share with you for recovery during the holidays is kind of a golden rule in 12-step programs. I don't know that this acronym actually, the origin is in 12-step programs, but that's certainly the first place that I heard it. HALT, which is an acronym that stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And it's sort of a self-check. Anytime you're feeling hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you can almost think of those as sort of risk factors for a relapse. And they have a way of sort of distorting our perception of the world. And you know what I mean? You just get a little bit hungry and a little bit hangry, and all of a sudden everything looks a little more bleak, doesn't it? And then you get some carbohydrates in your stomach and then everything's cool. And sometimes it's important to just keep that perspective, particularly with respect to the last two, feeling lonely and tired. I think there's a lot of us are at risk of being lonely during the holidays, and also at risk of being tired. We're sort of misled to believe that because we're laying around a lot of the holidays that we must be recharging our batteries. And I'm not sure that that's true. Oftentimes when I lay around, it just makes me feel inexplicably tired. And that's dangerous for me because it changes the way I see reality. And so kind of my just final holiday tip to you is whenever you're feeling any of those things, to halt, to assess it, to rectify it. Hey, do you need a nap? Do you need to leave this social situation? Do you need to get some food? Take care of yourself so that we can all be connected and we can all be safe during the holidays. So that's what I have for you. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have about just the experience of recovery during the holidays or anything of that nature. I think you can unmute yourselves if you have a question or pop something in the chat.
Thank you, Alex. This is Emily Henderson again with the Kentucky Hospital Association and the Kentucky SOS program. What a wonderful presentation, not only for those of us treating patients with substance use disorder, but also helpful hints for ourselves, our family members, our neighbors, those we love. So let's, by all means, please unmute yourself and ask a question to Dr. Alex Ellswick or type it in the chat box. While you're doing that, I'm going to put his email. Alex is always so kind to answer others' questions, or if you have questions regarding Voices of Hope or anything that he is affiliated with, he's always open to help others. So I'm going to type in his chat, his email, and I will also put the Kentucky SOS website in there. Any questions for Dr. Alex Ellswick?
Alex, it's Deb Campbell at KHA. I have a question for you. So if you have a family member who you suspect is struggling in some way, perhaps it is just, I don't want to say just anxiety, it's miserable, but I mean, maybe you don't know that they have any kind of substance abuse issue, but you sense that they're struggling. How much is it okay, or is it okay, or how much can you ask about that? How much can you confront that, or does that just make the anxiety worse? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
I do, yeah, and I appreciate your question. I think it's, to me, what is important would be how you go about it. One of the things that my family and I talk about a lot is we're really lucky that we broke through the shame of all the addiction stuff really early. My mom jokes and she'll say when she was in the grocery store while I was addicted, that she would see somebody she knew and they would ask about both of my sisters and they wouldn't ask her about me because they didn't want to have the uncomfortable conversation. And so my mom would blurt out, "Oh, and Alex is doing okay right now too. He's homeless, but he's, and it inevitably made people uncomfortable." But anyways, the reason I share that is because we always joke about what a benefit that was, that we broke through the shame and we just decided to be open with what we were dealing with. And in my experience, it's in the silence that leads to some of that suffering. And so I think bringing it above ground is really helpful. But you do want to be careful about how you do that, just because it's such a sensitive topic and you don't want to be sort of accusing people of being responsible for the way that they are. But yeah, I think reaching out and expressing concern is, and it might even be exactly what they need to get kind of a push in the right direction. So yeah, great question.
I have a question. So if you have a teenager, for example, that maybe transitioned out of a sport, like you gave the example of teens staying busy and active, and if they make a big transition to having more downtime, what would be some suggestions on how to occupy their time so that they don't turn to something like drugs or alcohol?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the biggest signs of things like depression and also of substance use disorder that we tend to miss is people no longer deriving pleasure from things that used to bring them pleasure. And so we talk about how when people get addicted, we sort of don't recognize our loved ones anymore. And that was definitely true for me. So after I got arrested, I actually got the chance to come back to Center College, but I chose not to play baseball. And at the time, I thought it was because I was too stressed. But when I look back, I realized it's because I wasn't getting joy from those things anymore. So in some respects, that alone can be kind of a risk factor. But then also, it was really problematic, just like you suggested, to all of a sudden have all this downtime. And in my case, I had a budding addiction and all this downtime. One of the things that I think is really helpful is, like, particularly if you have a kid who likes to be active, is like club sports. So like Lexington Sports and Social Club or something like that, where they don't have to be going to practices and it doesn't have to be a stressful thing, but it still allows them to have pro-social involvement, connect with others, get away from a screen. I mean, I think screens are drowning us in dopamine, and they're connected in some way to the opioid epidemic. I'm not seeing people talk about that, but that's my hunch. So yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what getting connected looks like, but when I think about my own experience, I wish I would have gotten involved with some other kind of sport, because there's just so many benefits to exercise, and you got to have something else to do other than drugs, right?
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Alex, you've got it. Go ahead. There's one in the chat box.
Okay. Any tips on how to reach out to someone we may think may be involved in some substance use to try to get them to open up? Also, any new insights into behavior to watch for, such as screen withdrawal? Yeah. Yes. I think that's just it. Like I said before, how you make your approach is really important. And one of the things I try to tell family members, trying to help them understand what their loved ones are experiencing, is when you're addicted and your brain becomes convinced that you need this drug to survive, now you have to protect your ability to use that drug. And what I mean by that is, when someone starts talking to you about treatment, for instance, oftentimes the first thing that I heard in my head when they said treatment was, you're not going to be able to get your drug. And when people talk about, here, let me help you do this or do that, all I heard is the ways that I was going to be harmed because I wasn't going to have access to my medication. And so that's where that defensiveness comes from initially. So it's helpful to make your approach from a place of love. Hey, I'm really concerned. I care about you. Here are some of the things I've noticed. Not to force anything upon someone, but maybe to lay out some options. And then I always encourage family members to consider getting connected themselves, whether that's an Al-Anon support group or at Voices of Hope. We actually have even slightly more secular support groups. One is called Smart Friends and Family, that's based on cognitive behavioral principles. And it's just, even if your loved one is continuing to use, it's really helpful to get around other parents who have similar experiences, who can share their experience, who can help consider what a boundary could look like, and help you with ways that they've been successful to get their loved ones, to consider treatment. It's a pretty big hurdle, but pretty important. Yeah, good question.
Other questions for Alex Ellswick at this time, either in the chat box or unmute yourself. You'll notice I did put his email, and he is always open to answer questions or provide insight and assistance if you want to reach out to him personally. Also, I put the Kentucky SOS website information, and you can always contact me, Emily Henderson, at ehenderson@kyha.com, and I can relay messages to Dr. Ellswick at the same time. I will send out this recording and slides to all the project leads, and it will be posted on the Kentucky SOS website in about a week. Are there any last questions for Dr. Alex Ellswick at this time? Hang on, looks like there's a
Yes.
message in the chat box.
So it says, you mentioned there are where people, it helped you get a job, et cetera. Where can a person turn to get help? My son's a hard worker, but every job he's applied to or starts requires a background check. He was in prison for trafficking and has a 5-year blanket employment history. Man, I appreciate that question, because that's the landscape that people are trying to recover in. We talk about recovery like it happens in a vacuum, and like all you got to do is quit putting drugs in your body and things will get better. And that is nonsense. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have a whole system that weights people down. Unfortunately, what I know is that your son's being punished over and over and over again for something that he already paid his debt to society for, and it's wrong. So I would start by saying that. The next thing I would say is, please have him or you reach out to Voices and let's get him connected with a recovery coach, because they'll help with all of those things. Particularly with employment, we keep a big list of recovery-friendly employers and things like that. It's really a challenge. It's really a challenge. And my biggest fear is that people get discouraged and feel like they're doing something wrong, that they're not enjoying success in recovery. And he's not doing anything wrong. He's applying for the jobs. He's pounding the pavement, doing the hard work. He just really needs an opportunity. So yeah, get him connected with us, or there are other recovery community organizations out there as well, including like the Peer in Northern Kentucky, the LRCC in Louisville, who all do similar kinds of things. So great question there. And then I have another question here on the direct message. It says, how do you connect with those in recovery that go through the depression and pull away from everything they enjoy? That's a really good question. And if we had more time, we could talk some brain science that helps explain why it's so complicated. But in layman's terms, the same part of your brain that gets hijacked in addiction is the part of your brain that you need to connect and bond with other people. It's the reward pathway. And so it is a tremendous challenge. I mean, early in recovery, you can go through the motions and do the things that relational people do, but it feels pretty transactional. It's pretty hard to experience that. I call it the warm fuzzies, that feeling when you walk away from an interaction with someone where you really feel meaningfully connected. You're almost bereft of your ability to even experience that early in recovery. So early on, the first couple of months, it's kind of just a dogfight to keep people, in recovery, keep them abstinent. And then once their brain begins to do at least a little bit of meaningful healing, that's when I want people to be involved and connected in as many ways as possible. And really, people need to be connected from the start, because that's going to accelerate upregulation of dopamine, which means accelerate the healing of the brain. But, that's one of the benefits of rehab. Even though rehab saved my life, I hate rehab with a burning passion. And one of the things that I hated about it is that I was forced to be around all these strangers with my social anxiety. Of course, I didn't like that. But one of the things that I found is that it's good for me. That part of the reason I tended to have success while I was in rehab is because I was forced to be around people all day long and to have social interactions. And as it turns out, my brain actually likes that. So even though it's challenging, it's really critical. And, the first time, my very first shot at recovery, I spent every night in my basement alone. And it is no wonder that I relapsed, So great question. Someone has asked, in what ways and where can we advocate for recovering persons? That's a great question. I'll tell you one that you can do right now. There's a sentencing disparity between crack and coke. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with this, but because there's a perception that crack is predominantly a Black inner city drug, there's 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between coke and crack. In other words, if you're found in possession of a single gram of crack cocaine, you'll be sentenced as severely as if you had 100 grams of powder cocaine. And it's completely nonsensical, because from a pharmacological perspective, they're exactly the same drug, just a different route of administration. So then in 2010, the Obama administration sought to rectify that with what they called the Fair Sentencing Act. And it only reduced that disparity to an even more arbitrary 18-to-1. So fortunately, I say all that to say, there's a measure that's just passed the House, I think it's called the Equal Act, that would restore that disparity to 1-to-1, which is really important advocacy for people who use drugs, but also it would do so retroactively. So I just listened to a panel discussion the other day that featured a mother whose son has been incarcerated for 25 years. under some of these mandatory minimums, and he would actually be allowed to come home under this provision. So I would say write to your senators about that today and ask them to please vote yes. And also you can get connected with advocacy through Voices. It's a part of our mission. It's actually in our mission statement that we do advocacy. And so we love to get you involved however we can. Thank you for asking that. And someone asked for the group's website. Let me drop that in the chat as well. Oh, someone already has. Emily's done that for us. voicesofhopelex.org. You can find us on Facebook, Voices of Hope Lexington. And I think that's the questions that I see here.
Great questions, great dialogue. Any other questions for Dr. Alex Ellswick at this time? Alex, you're getting a lot of kudos in the chat box.
Good, thank you.
Which we want to echo, and also just always thank you for your time and your perspective, and this helps us not only professionally but also personally. So thank you so much. Thank you for always being open and available, and by all means, I know you have an open door to anyone who is looking for help. So please utilize Dr. Alex Ellswick. Use this program. We're so fortunate that you sit on the SOS Advisory Committee to provide your perspective. So any last minute questions? Otherwise, we will sign off for today and look forward to more work regarding our opioid crisis in our state, and how we each work every day trying to better our state and to help our patients across the state. Any last minute questions for Dr. Alex Ellswick? Okay. Well, without any further questions, thank you so much for joining today. We look forward to next month's webinar. You will be receiving information on that. As always, feel free to contact me anytime. Dr. Ellswick, thank you so much, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you guys.